And hello Stowe community, welcome to part 5 of our Back to Basics tutorial series. In this tutorial I'm going to talk mostly about dialogues, and there are 4 types of dialogues that you can add to a Foundry mission. I've separated them into groups of 2. The first 2 you can think of as storyboard dialogues, right? Here's the storyboard, and there are 2 types of dialogues that we can add to the storyboard. And that's dialogue with contact, which we've already done with talking to the Vulcan diplomat. And then there's also something called pop-up dialogues. Those we can add to the storyboard. And the reason that I separate these from the other types of dialogues is because they are mandatory. If they're part of the storyboard, it means that a player is going to experience them. They have no choice. Whereas the other 2 types of dialogues, and I'll show those to you in a minute. The other types of dialogues are optional. They don't have to be part of the player experience, and they can also be used in conjunction with triggers. And triggers will be the next tutorial in our set of Back to Basics tutorial series. So what I'll do is in this part 5, we'll talk about the basic storyboard dialogues. Then part 6 we'll get into triggers, and then part 7 we'll talk about the dialogues used in conjunction with triggers. So that's how we'll proceed. But let's go ahead and start. We've already put in a dialogue with contact. It's talk to the Vulcan diplomat. The Vulcan diplomat is on the ground map. Now, when the objective is to talk to the contact in the storyboard, it means that the player will physically have to find the NPC on a map, and the NPC will have an icon above their head to talk to them. The player will talk to the person, and that will be the task. The task will be resolved when the player stops talking to the contact. And with the talk to contact, right now she just says howdy. But if we click on this button, Advanced Dialogue Editor, that's where we can do things that are much more complex. So let's say we get to Vulcan and there's a murder to solve, and this diplomat is a witness. Then the first box, she can say, do you have any questions for me? And from that point on, we can add questions. Question number 1, question number 2, and so on. And then following each question can be a different response by the NPC. And you can even branch it further, giving the player choices of which follow-up questions to ask, and she could have different answers for different follow-up questions. But in the end, you'll probably want to have an extra button here that says I have no more questions, and then all the other boxes will go back up to the top so that a player can ask each question and then decide, okay, I'm done asking questions. Now, the branching dialogues can get much more complex. They don't always have to go up. They can go to the sides. They can do really interesting things with puzzles. And when you start to mess around with making puzzles, you're going to learn how to do branching dialogue very quickly. But for now, these are kind of the most basic forms of branching dialogue that you'll be messing with as you start writing your missions. You'll also notice that there's an option here for success or failure. If you have a path down the tree of a branching dialogue and it results in failure, that doesn't mean that the player fails the mission. It means the player fails the dialogue, and they'll have to go through the dialogue tree again to try to find the right answer. So you don't always have to link something to another box. It could just end in, hey, you have to do this dialogue over again. Okay, so that's really the most basic type of dialogue. That's probably what you'll feel comfortable using first, is to put an NPC on a map, and then in the storyboard put the task to interact with that NPC on the list of things for the player to do. Now, a different thing that you can do is, say the first task is not to talk to a person, but it's to interact with an object. Say it's to scan a console, and you're scanning a console for a clue. Well, in Star Trek Online, when the player scans something in the Foundry, nothing happens afterwards. It just, the scan is complete. So often what you have to do is you have to put in a pop-up dialogue, and usually this is your bridge officer on on your away team or on your ship who has to tell you what you're seeing. And this is probably one of the most annoying parts of being a Foundry author is if you play Stowe, you know that the devs have these generic icons. When a player interacts with a console or a computer, there's, say, a generic Federation logo, and they're reading technical information off a computer, or they're reading their tricorder, or something that's not their bridge officer speaking to them. But in the Foundry, because we have to use costumes following object interacts, usually our bridge officers have to say, "Captain, my scans concur. I'm reading life forms over there," or "Captain, allow me to translate this for you." There is a workaround, but it's not pretty. If you, oops, that's the wrong box. If you search for asset view and you can search for prop, then you can get some of these non-sentient things. They never look good. I mean, as costumes, you'll get the legs of a costume, or you'll get the back of a generator, or you might get something that looks like this. And so they're not pretty, but if you really need a non-character costume for a dialogue, you can use these. I've used them myself. I don't really like how they look, but sometimes you have to use them. And like with the Talk to Contact, this has an advanced dialogue editor, but notice that you don't have the option on just a pop-up dialogue to fail or succeed. And the reason for that is the pop-up happens one time. It's triggered and a player reads it, and once they're done with it, it never comes back. And there's nothing a player can do to make that dialogue pop-up come back. So there's no reason that you'd want a player to fail it because they can't redo it. And the last thing I want to show you here is if you have the NPC on a map and the NPC isn't part of a Talk to Contact story objective, so it's just, they're not over here, but they are just a character on the map. If you click on them, there is this box that says has default prompt. You can click on that, and that means that anytime that NPC isn't part of a task that the player has to do, then the player can still interact with them, and they say something like, the weather's nice today, or basically something that a city person might say, or a village person, or a pedestrian. That's the word I'm looking for. Is if you're wandering around a map and just randomly talking to people for clues, you can use these has default text as ways to give players clues. Now, in part 7, I'm going to show you some much more advanced stuff that you can do with this has default text, because if you notice, there are triggers attached to them. There are triggers attached to the Talk to Contact NPCs as well. But we'll get into that after I introduce you to triggers. Okay, and the last thing that I want to show you is the fourth type of dialogue, which you add directly to the map. And I already had one on there, which I didn't mean to. But if you're on the map tab and you're looking directly on the map, you'll see this. It's a blue bubble, it's Popup Dialogue, and you can add it to the map. Don't worry about this until you understand triggers, because the only way to use these effectively is with triggers. I mean, sometimes you can use them without triggers, but definitely hold off on messing around with these guys until next time. Okay.